The sun is down, the house is quiet, and you are not as alone as you think. Welcome to Ghostly Tales. I'm your host, Mel, and these are stories meant for the dark and for those brave enough to listen to them.
The Concrete Dungeon. The basement of the house I grew up in was one of the creepiest places on earth to me. It felt like a dungeon, all old and concrete, and I absolutely hated being down there. The house always felt like something else was there with us. My parents only validated that fear. They casually mentioned that when they were down there doing laundry, they would hear the sound of footsteps walking right on the concrete. But the worst part was a little door that led to a crawl space. My dad told me he found bones and a pair of little kid shoes inside. He was sure they were just animal bones, but it still completely freaked me out. The only reason my sister and I ever went down there was for a project. My dad had a big wooden bar in the basement, and for whatever reason, my parents put a dollhouse down there that they wanted us to build. One day, my sister and I were sitting on the bar stools talking about the dollhouse when she thought it would be funny to play a prank. She suddenly bolted from her stool, ran up the stairs, and turned off the light. I tried not to panic, thinking she would quickly turn them back on. But as I sat there in the dark, I looked up. I could swear I saw distorted heads hanging from the ceiling, their mouths wide agape. It could have been the wild imagination of a small child mixed with sudden panic, but that is exactly what I saw. I ran up the stairs crying and panicking. I completely refused to go down there ever again. Thankfully, we didn't stay in that house for too much longer. It was torn down not long after we moved away due to poor foundation issues. But looking back, I still wonder about the heavy feeling in that house and what was really waiting in the dark beneath it. The Boy on the Ceiling. When my son was 5, money was tight, and we moved into a low-income townhouse complex. Families came and went all the time, so there was always someone moving in or out. Not long after we settled in, my son started talking about a boy in the house. At first, I didn't think much of it. Kids have vivid imaginations, and I assumed he had made up an imaginary friend to keep himself entertained. Every now and then, he'd casually mention the boy while he was playing. The boy was in my room today, or the boy was watching me play. It never seemed to bother him at first, so I mostly brushed it off. A few weeks later, though, his behavior started to change. He stopped wanting to play by himself upstairs. If I was downstairs cleaning or watching television, he'd bring his toys down and stay close to me. At bedtime, he started asking me to leave his door open. One evening, I asked him why he didn't like being alone anymore. He looked at me for a moment before quietly saying, "The boy keeps watching me." I tried to reassure him and asked where the boy was. My son slowly looked up toward the ceiling. Up there. I felt a knot form in my stomach. What do you mean, up there? He stays on the ceiling and watches. The way he said it was completely matter-of-fact, like he was describing something normal. I told him it was probably a dream or his imagination, but he shook his head. No, he's really there. For months, the story never changed. It was always the same little boy, quiet, watching. Then, one afternoon, I was talking with a neighbor who had lived in the complex for years. We got on the subject of former tenants, and she mentioned the family who had lived in our townhouse before us. They had a young son with serious health problems. According to her, he passed away while they were living there. I never told her what my son had been saying. I never mentioned the boy on the ceiling. Not long after that conversation, my son stopped talking about him altogether. One day, I asked what happened to his friend. He went away,
he said, with a shrug. We moved out the following year. My son barely remembers living there now, but I still remember the way he looked toward the ceiling whenever he talked about that boy. And I've never been completely sure it was just his imagination.
The Forgotten Church. A few years ago, my wife and I were on vacation in the mountains and spent most of our time hiking. One afternoon, we decided to explore a trail that wasn't on any of the maps. It looked like an old path that had been used years ago, but mostly forgotten. After about 20 minutes of walking through the woods, we came across an old graveyard hidden among the trees. Most of the headstones were weathered so badly you couldn't read them anymore, but a few still had dates on them. I remember seeing several from the late 1800s. Some of the graves had sunk into the ground, and others were covered in roots and brush. A little farther beyond the cemetery were the remains of a small church. It was mostly collapsed. Parts of the roof were gone, and trees were growing through what had once been the sanctuary. It looked like nobody had been there in decades. We spent a while walking around, taking pictures and looking at the old graves. The whole place felt isolated, but not necessarily creepy. At least, not at first. While we were standing near what was left of the church entrance, I heard what sounded like a man's voice coming from inside. It was deep, but I couldn't make out what it was saying. I assumed another hiker had found the place, so I called out to see if anyone was there. No one answered. A minute later, I heard the voice again. This time, it sounded louder. My wife heard it too. We walked a little closer, trying to see if someone was inside the ruins. That's when a stone hit the ground a few feet from us. I looked around immediately, expecting to see somebody messing with us, but there was nobody there. Then another rock came flying out from somewhere near the church and struck a tree. Before we could even process that, a third stone landed behind us from a completely different direction. At that point, the voice came again. It was still too deep and distorted to understand. It sounded like someone speaking, but neither of us could make out a single word. Then more stones started hitting around us. That was enough for us. We turned around and headed back toward the trail as fast as we could. I never saw who or what threw those rocks. Maybe there was someone out there hidden in the woods. Maybe there was a perfectly normal explanation, but it still creeps me out. One of the most famous stories about the Ozark Howler comes from the late 1800s. According to local legend, a man was traveling through the Ozark Hills after dark when he heard a sound that stopped him in his tracks. At first, he thought it might be a wolf somewhere in the distance, but the cry came again, louder this time. It wasn't a wolf. It wasn't a mountain lion. The sound was unlike anything he had ever heard before. A long, haunting howl that echoed through the hills and seemed to come from everywhere at once. As he listened, he noticed movement near the edge of the trees. Standing just beyond the road was a large, dark animal. The man later described it as bigger than any wolf he had ever seen. It had a thick, shaggy coat and strange, glowing eyes reflecting in the darkness. For a moment, the creature stood completely still. Then it let out another howl. The sound was so powerful that the man claimed it sent a chill straight through him. Before he could get a better look, the creature turned and disappeared into the woods. By the time he reached the spot where it had been standing, there was nothing there. Stories like this helped give birth to the legend of the Ozark Howler. More than a century later, people across Missouri and Arkansas still report hearing strange cries in the Ozark Mountains. Whether it's an unknown animal, a misidentified predator, or something else entirely, nobody has ever been able to explain every sighting. So what do you think? Was the man simply mistaken, or did he encounter something that still roams the Ozarks today? A few years back, I put a trail camera up in the woods behind my house. My family owns the property, and I keep a few cameras out there to watch deer movement throughout the year. One evening, I decided to check one of the cameras before it got too late. It was already getting dark by the time I made it back there, so I swapped the memory card, made sure everything was working, and started heading back toward the house. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. A few days later, when I checked that camera again, I brought the memory card home and started looking through the photos. Most of them were what you'd expect: deer, squirrels, a raccoon. Then I came across a picture that made me stop. The camera had taken a photo of me as I was walking away from it during my previous visit. At first, I didn't notice anything unusual. Then I saw someone else in the picture. A man was walking down the trail about 10 feet ahead of me. I stared at it for a long time. I remembered that stretch of trail clearly. It wasn't thick brush where somebody could hide. I could see well enough with my flashlight, and if someone had been walking that close in front of me, I would have noticed. But there wasn't anybody there. I was alone. I zoomed in on the figure, thinking maybe it was a shadow or some strange trick of the camera. It wasn't. It looked like an ordinary man wearing dark clothes walking down the trail. He wasn't looking back at me. He wasn't looking at the camera. He just looked like someone walking through the woods. I checked every photo before and after it. There was nothing. Just that one picture. The camera never caught him again. I've shown that photo to plenty of people over the years, and nobody has ever come up with an explanation that makes sense. All I know is that I remember walking back to the house that night, and there wasn't anybody on that trail in front of me. The playroom. When our kids were younger, we had a room at the end of the hallway that we used as a playroom. Most of their toys were kept in there, so they spent a lot of time playing in that room. After a while, we started noticing little things that didn't make much sense. The room always felt colder than the rest of the house. Not freezing cold, just enough that you noticed it whenever you walked in. Then there were the lights. The kids would be playing in the room, and the lights would suddenly turn off. It happened often enough that they started complaining about it. At first, we figured one of them was flipping the switch and blaming the other, but both of them insisted they weren't touching it. We didn't think much of it. Then, one evening at dinner, my daughter mentioned someone named Lewis. My wife and I assumed she was talking about a kid from school. When we asked who Lewis was, she said, "The man in the playroom." We laughed and figured she had an imaginary friend. A few days later, our son mentioned Lewis too. We asked what Lewis looked like, and both of them described the same man. Neither of them seemed scared. They talked about him like he was just another person in the room. Sometimes they'd say Lewis was just sitting in the corner, watching them play. The whole thing made us uncomfortable, but we still figured it was just kids being kids. Then one afternoon, both of the kids came running out of the playroom crying. My wife was in the kitchen and immediately asked what happened. Our daughter said the lights had turned off again. Before either of us could say anything, our son looked down the hallway toward the playroom and said, "Lewis did it." For the first time, both of them seemed genuinely scared. Neither one would go back into the room. That was enough for us. We moved the toys into another part of the house and turned the playroom into a storage room. The kids never wanted to play in there again, and honestly, we didn't want to step foot in it either. Over time, they stopped talking about Lewis. They're older now and barely remember any of it. The room is still there. It still feels colder than the rest of the house. And even after all these years, we keep the door shut. Nobody really goes in there anymore. The swing. When I was about 7, we lived in a house with a massive old oak tree in the backyard. The previous owners had left a tire swing hanging from one of the thickest branches, and it quickly became my favorite spot to play. After we had been there a few weeks, I started hearing a girl faintly giggling out by the tree. I didn't think much of it at first, assuming it was just the wind through the leaves or someone playing in a neighboring yard. Then, early one morning, I woke up at early sunrise and looked out my bedroom window into the foggy backyard. A little girl was sitting on the roots right under the tree, just staring up at the house. I went and told my parents about her, but they had no idea who she could be and said no kids should be out that early. A few days later, I was out back on the tire swing. As I swung high, I caught a glimpse of her peeking out from behind the thick trunk of the oak tree. It startled me, and I dragged my feet to a sudden stop. I got off the swing and walked over to check behind the tree, expecting to finally see who it was. There was no one there. The yard was empty of anyone but me. I stopped playing over by the swing after that afternoon. Honestly, I barely wanted to go into the backyard at all. I felt unsettled being out there after that experience. We eventually moved to a new house, and I never did find out who was watching me from that tree.
Thanks for listening to Ghostly Tales. If you enjoyed these stories, please leave us a review. It helps more listeners find their way into the dark. We'll be back next Wednesday with more tales.